Oh, there we go. Okay, so there's my email address. Feel free to contact me. I know there was a couple of people who had sent me questions in the chat box, and I didn't respond quickly enough. I think you'd probably departed last week by the time I was answering your questions. So feel free to email me if you have some questions afterwards. So I think we'll just kind of jump into things, although I did want to leave the door open if there's some questions. And I guess Kent's suggestion that you can type them into the chat box. Some people get kind of stage fright when they're getting used to Zoom, and it's hard to just speak up. But I'll give you just a couple of seconds here. If anybody has questions that you're wanting to be sure that we talk about tonight. Sean, you can tell me if you see something on the chat, and I'll just give you a second here if you want to use your voice to ask. Nothing coming up so far? Okay. All right, well then we will get into things. So just a couple of slides as a quick refresher from last time. And I'm going to read my notes, just as I said the last time. Usually I'm more likely to just talk without reading, but the problem is that when I just talk, I don't get through all the materials. So I'll read the notes so that hopefully we'll get through all this information before we close this evening. So you'll remember from last time that most people experiencing normal grief have a period of sorrow and numbness and even guilt and anger. And many people, while they're grieving, have trouble engaging socially. Now, for some people, the grief lasts longer periods of time and there might be more symptoms, but it continues to fall within a normal spectrum. So some of the additional symptoms that might be happening for people, I've talked to many people who've started to think about their own death, sometimes a wish for death, but just sometimes kind of an existential awareness that there will be an end to life and wondering about what they're going to do with the rest of life. People talk about feelings of worthlessness, talk about not being able to manage their everyday kinds of things that they do, caring for themselves, and then this real strong sense of unreality, or this can't be true, this can't be what's happened. So with a normal experience of loss, as you remember, we talked about these feelings gradually ease, and it's possible to accept the loss, whether that's of a person or a job or a life experience. It's possible to move forward with life. People have different experiences of grief, and it happens in different orders. When I first started in the counseling world, there were kind of stages they talked about, but my experience has been that people go through things at a different pace, different order, and not everybody even experiences the same stages. But the things that happen in general is a process where gradually accepting that this is the new normal, this is real, become more and more tolerant of the pain that goes along with loss, and then kind of adjusting to that new reality and being interested in having some new experiences again. Now, complicated loss happens when people continue to grieve for very, very long periods of time. They seem to get stuck in that place where they can't accept the reality of what they've lost. And for many of these people, they say that they just can't tolerate the pain, the psychic pain that goes along with the loss. So they get kind of stuck in it. The core symptoms of complicated grief are related to this kind of persistent yearning and preoccupation, almost an obsession with what they lost. It looks very similar to depression, but with depression, there's more of a free-floating sadness, whereas with the grief, the complicated grief, there's this ongoing yearning or obsession with what was lost. So when a person has a complicated experience of grief, they may not get better naturally. And sometimes what's been happening with these folks is that they found kind of unhealthy ways maybe to manage those painful feelings. And I think predominantly is what I've seen is some variety of addictive behaviors that interfere with that grieving process, sort of numb the pain, and the person doesn't learn how to go through it. So we'll talk a bit more about management in a couple of minutes, but that's sort of a summary of what we talked about in terms of grief. Now, talking about depression, again, a summary. As I said last week, grief isn't depression. They're not the same. And sadness isn't depression. Everybody goes through blue days and has some sad experiences. So true depression, that is a diagnosed mental illness, lasts for at least 2 weeks before a doctor will nail that down. And they will have people going through depression, sort of probably obvious, but a depressed mood, and a loss of interest or enjoyment in just about everything in their lives. The other things that go along with depression, people will have some of these symptoms, not all of them, although some people have all of them, is a marked loss of pleasure in things. So some people function with their depression, but they just don't enjoy what they're doing, and they may function at that level, kind of a low-level grief of no pleasure, but continuing to function for sometimes, for some people, many years. Often weight is affected when people are depressed, either gaining weight or losing weight. Some people might have an increased appetite, some people a decreased appetite. People talk about really being slowed down. They don't move very fast. And for some people, what happens is they're very, very restless. They might be agitated even, but they feel like their activity is sort of pointless. They're not managing anything. So they might rustle papers or pace or those sorts of things. Most people that are depressed are tired all the time. They just feel like they can't get enough sleep. And so as a result, some people sleep a lot and some people can't sleep at all. They really have trouble falling asleep. It certainly affects people's ability to think or concentrate. Hard to read a book, sometimes hard to read one article in the newspaper. So that sort of focus disappears. And often with depression goes along with thoughts about suicide. And I'll get to that in just a minute or two. So as I said last week also, depression is connected to low levels of some various transmitters in the brain, or neurotransmitters in the brain. So that's where they talk about depression being a biochemical disorder. Now, there was a question last week about postpartum depression, and we could probably spend a whole evening, if not more time, on postpartum depression. So I'm just going to touch on it briefly. But certainly postpartum depression falls into the category of depression that's related to the impact of the person's body chemistry on their mood. So there are varying degrees of postpartum depression, for some a few hours, for some a few weeks, and for some a very long period of depression. When it's more brief, they'll describe it as the blues, but it can move into a true depression. I know when I had my son, I went through, in the first couple of days, my son turned yellow, and it was very scary, my first experience of a baby. And in those days, they didn't have babies rooming in with you. They were down the hall in the nursery. And so I couldn't stay away from him. I was down the hall, and all I could do really was put my hand in the little compartment that they had him in, put my hand on his back. And I cried and cried and cried. One of the nurses came along and put her arm around my shoulder and said, "It's okay, dear, it'll get better." And she seemed to know what was happening for me. So that was like a light went off and then it went on. After a couple of hours, the tears were done and it was all okay again. So it wasn't stress related or anything. It was clearly my body sort of doing a recalculation. And for some people, this can be a very long-term experience. I think the difficulty of postpartum depression is if a person could accept it and just move on, no, this is what my body does, that would be one thing. But most people that go through postpartum depression also um, go through other kinds of complications. For one thing is there's the worry about taking medication. What sort of impact might the medication have on the baby? Some people have depression prior to getting pregnant. And so their risk of postpartum depression gets greater if they stop taking their medication treatment before they have the baby or before they get pregnant. The other thing that happens is that people often judge themselves. And so they're really afraid that other people are going to judge them, that they're not taking pleasure with the baby. They're not finding it easy to bond with their baby because their mood is so affected. And so with the guilt that goes along with that, for many people, it's also hard to ask for help, hard to ask for support. My experience with postpartum depression has been that most women who experience that find a support group more helpful than other kinds of treatment if they feel like they're not able to get as much support as they want within their family. And I know certainly some people won't even go to their family because they don't want to burden them or they feel embarrassed around them. So the challenge with people with postpartum depression going to see an individual counselor is that kind of highlights the stigma of it, that you're going in a place that's private, nobody knows you're there, and there's something wrong with you because you're in this treatment room. And whereas a support group allows you to be around other people going through the same experience, reduces that isolation, can often take the shame away as people understand that they're like other people and get some sense from other people of how they've managed it. So that's my brief lecture on postpartum depression, and it probably isn't the detail that the person with the question was looking for, but that's kind of a brief touch on it for how much time we have this evening. So let's see if I can find there we go. Oh, I'm not remembering to change my slides. So I mentioned that one of the symptoms of depression is thoughts about suicide. And my gosh, this is one of our big concerns. I think that that's why people are so nervous about depression, is they're always wondering, is suicide going to be the end result of this? So when we love somebody, we worry about what kind of symptoms they might be experiencing. And certainly people who are depressed are more at risk of suicide than other people. So there's a variety of different kinds of warning signs that might come out to help you know whether there's a risk of suicide. But this is as individual as how many people go through these thoughts. There's all kinds of reasons why people might think about suicide. And some of the ways that you might know what's happening is that a person might be saying very negative things about themselves. They might even be talking about dying. They might even be talking about having a plan to die. Often people who are thinking about suicide may not have told anybody about it, but they're starting to put their personal affairs in order. So sorting out their will, and might be talking to people about, if something happens to me, will you take my dog for me, and those kinds of things. So that's sometimes a warning sign that you can watch for. I think probably there you have a sense of this hopelessness or desperation for a person that might be thinking about suicide, that the future just looks bleak to them. And so they may not say, I'm thinking about suicide, but they may be saying, what's the point? Why am I here? I'm just a burden for everybody. I know that some folks have thoughts about suicide without any kind of clear plan for years and years. And so families and friends may have heard about this for a long time from them. And their concern about what they're hearing becomes somewhat blunted because the person has talked about it so much. So that's a challenge, because sometimes those people do follow through and act on the suicide, and then it's very difficult for friends and family. And yet, as far as they could tell, nothing had changed. They knew that a person was thinking about it, but they couldn't tell where that decision point was, where they moved from thinking about it to deciding they needed to act. So there's the struggle. Now, the hardest time is when people's mood improves. For some folks, they're so relieved when they come to terms with their decision, that they're done, that there's not any more question. They've picked a date and a time, and their mood lifts. And so friends and family are jubilant because they think that they've recovered. And in fact, the person may not be depressed anymore because they're so relieved that their pain is going to end. They know what the end is going to be. And then it's devastating for families when they thought it was okay, and then this person's life ended. And for some people, there's no warning signs at all. They don't give any inkling to people. They don't want to burden people. They don't know how to express it. They don't know how to talk about it at all. And so sometimes it happens without any kind of warning at all. I've worked with many, many families over the years that I provided counseling, and families in lots of pain when a person made the decision to end their lives. And they couldn't figure out why. And I think what happens is that the pain of living is so unbearable, they just can't conceive that there's any other choice for them. Why that is, I don't know. What is it that sort of crosses the line for people where they felt that they could manage and then it became unbearable? I don't know what that is, and I don't know how to tell people how to look for that. It is so individualized. One of the things that I want you to consider is information that comes from the Mental Health Commission of Canada. And they've asked us to describe suicide as dying of suicide, rather than describing it as committing suicide. And the reason for that is to reduce the stigma around it. The term committing suicide is related to the point in history when suicide was considered a crime. So an individual was committing a crime, which was suicide, and that's how that expression came about. But it's really well recognized now that for some people, depression is actually a terminal illness. And death is no different for some people than people who have cancer or Parkinson's disease or MS. Many people don't die of these diseases. Most people don't die of depression. But for some people, the illness wreaks such damage on their self-esteem that life is no longer bearable for them. So that's kind of a bleak discussion, but certainly is a question for many people. Now, the things that we can do, I think that's more important, is what do we do about that? Now, I wondered if any of you think the same thing as me. That picture looks like Kent to me. I found it online. It looks like when Kent's really getting into a discussion with somebody. Anyway, so what can you do about it? So the first thing is being able to talk about it, and that's the primary thing. Being able to engage with a person um, in a discussion about the symptoms. There's a couple of challenges for friends and family. First challenge is the fear related to living with the threat of suicide. And the second challenge is when a person dies of suicide, there's such guilt for most caregivers. I just saw a chat come up is just fantastic, and I want to highlight for people. There is a course called Assist that's run by, no, it isn't the Mental Health Commission of Canada, but you can look online and you'll find information about that course. And actually, that's something Kent, you folks could even arrange for this group of people, is to put on an assist course if there's enough people that want to know more about managing it. And the SAFE course, Daryl, that's right. The SAFE course is a briefer course. Living Works, that's the name of the people that put them on. So SAFE is the first one, and Assist is a longer course. I think 2 or 3 days for Assist. So what comes of that training, I think for myself when I took it, the most helpful piece of it was the comfort in talking about suicide, because this seems like just one of the most risky things to talk about. I know people will say to me, well, I really don't want to bring this up. I'm sort of worried about it, but if I bring it up, it might increase the risk. They might think more about suicide. I might plant an idea in their head that they never had. And that's a myth. Actually, that isn't what happens. Talking about suicide doesn't make it more likely to happen. What I found, and again, I keep going back to how long I've been around, but in 40 years, what I found was that when I engaged with people about talking about suicide, they didn't act on it. The thing that makes people safe is the freedom to talk. So if you bring up suicide when the person isn't even considering it, they'll probably laugh and say, "No," but I'm sure glad that you care. But having had that discussion, if they've had depression and they know that you're a person that feels okay to talk about suicide, they may come to you in the future. So you want to make it clear that you can tolerate hearing about those symptoms. And once you're able to open that door, that's what keeps people safe. So simply just asking how they're doing, what they're thinking about, and actually not beating around the bush. Asking people if they might harm themselves is only sort of an introductory statement, because that might mean all kinds of different things. But are you thinking about suicide? Are you thinking about dying? Being able to say that to person opens the door. And they know then that you care enough about them to have a hard conversation with them. The stigma around depression and suicide makes it so hard for people to ask for help. And so you're breaking a barrier, you're getting rid of some of that stigma by just asking. Once you've opened that door, you might want to talk a little bit. Well, you will want to talk about the risk, what sort of risk there is with this person. So the best way to find out about that is to find out if they have a plan. And so some people might say, yes, I plan to kill myself at some point, but they don't have any specifics. And so they certainly need support, but they're not at a high risk point. So you want to know if they know how they're going to kill themselves, when, where, and knowing all that information helps you to keep them safe. So they might tell you, I've been stockpiling pills. And if that's the case, you may want to go with them to their house and ask them to show you places where the pills are and collect pills. If they're willing to talk with you about this and you're concerned, what is very helpful is to engage support for support from medical folks as well. So it's very important you don't keep this secret. You don't want to keep talk of suicide secret. You want to talk about it with people that they're close to. Don't, even if somebody says to you, well, I want to tell a secret, do you promise you won't tell? And you say, yeah, I promise. If that person says, well, the secret is I'm going to kill myself, then all holds are off. You're not going to keep that secret. You're going to talk about what sort of connections to connect people to.
Ruth, I'm just going to interrupt for just a moment, that as folks are listening to you and as they're looking at the chat, they can maybe jot a few notes. Folks are just listing some of the different programs that would be good follow-up for this too, including an online one called Safe Talk. Sorry to interrupt you there.
Thank you very much for that. There's another one that's come up from Lindsay about mental health first aid. Yes, I'm glad that you're putting those on the chat. I was seeing them pop up. All good courses. So mental health first aid addresses suicide as well. There's a part of one afternoon that's about suicide assist, the SAFE program, and you can look that information up. There's courses going on actually all the time. I think with COVID, as you've mentioned, there's some online stuff, but probably more online stuff even now than there was previously. But again, you folks also could sponsor something like this for your community of churches within our province. There could be a course sponsored. So if you feel like that's a topic you want to get into more, I strongly encourage you to do that. Remembering the important thing about talking about suicide is getting more comfortable talking about suicide. Because once you are, you will be the greatest protector for that person that you have concern for. It's simply the courage to bring it up that creates the safety for a person. So thanks for sharing those chats about the various different programs available. Okay, so last time we didn't get into talking about anxiety. And so we'll talk about that for a couple of minutes, and then we'll move into talking about coping strategies for grief, depression, and anxiety, and what folks might be able to do. So anxiety is actually a normal reaction to stress and dangerous situations. We'd be in trouble if we didn't have anxiety to tell us that there's some risk. It alerts us to danger. It helps us to pay attention and then prepare for whatever kind of risk is in our environment. Anxiety is appropriate and usually is time limited. So if I didn't have a bit of anxiety about the presentation, getting ready to talk to you guys, I'd say, oh, I've talked about this for years and I don't need to prepare at all. The chances that it would turn out to be helpful to people are minimal. So there's lots of things in our lives, if we didn't have a bit of anxiety triggering us to do well at something, we wouldn't do as well as we could. The challenge is that anxiety can move into becoming more of a disordered experience. And what happens is that the anxiety becomes longer term, kind of gets stuck in the wheel of worry, and also becomes out of proportion for the situation. So people can get more nervous and anxious in situations that really don't warrant that, as their sense of anxiety gets heightened. And so once that happens, that can start to interfere with your ability to function at home and at work. And it can become quite disabling. Anxiety is the most common mental health disorder, and it affects about 1/3 of people at some point in their lives. It is very disabling. I worked in a treatment program for people with chronic mental health issues, and many of the people that were part of that program were involved simply because their anxiety stopped them from being able to function at home or at work. I recall working with one fellow who had to get up at 4 in the morning in order to go through all the routines that he required of himself, even to get to our treatment program. And so anxiety can become very, very disabling for people. People can be locked into their homes because of their fears of what they might come across in the world around them. Now, during COVID, low-grade worry has become the norm. And I think as time has gone on, the worry has become higher and higher. Recently, we've become jubilant about treatments being available, and we're almost there. Eventually, maybe by May, we'll all have needles in our arms. But in the meantime, they're telling us there's a horrible variant killing people in Regina. And so just as we start to get a little bit complacent, the worry gets big again. And so even for people who don't struggle with anxiety in normal times, anxiety is now kind of our way of life. What if I forgot to sanitize? Has that person got their mask on properly? Did I get too close to somebody in Costco? So there's all of these things that we can't control in our environment that have a huge potential impact on our own health. So anxiety comes along when we feel like we can't control things. And anxious people are trying to put some control back in their lives. And so often what's happening is this hypervigilance. If I worry enough, if I pay attention enough, if I watch out for risk enough, I'll be able to stay safe. And I've had discussions with people where I've said, do you think worry keeps you safe? When I first started doing this work, I thought they'd say, no, worry is the problem. But what I found out is actually people are terrified to give up their worry because they believe if they worry, it'll help them be vigilant and it'll help them to be safe. So certainly all the things going on right now makes it even harder for people who were already struggling with anxiety in the first place. No wonder this has become a bigger health problem. Many people have become, well, all of us are isolated at home because we're supposed to be, but many are starting to wonder, can I even let myself go out again? Because I'm so afraid of what might happen. We're compulsive about hand washing. We're compulsive about all kinds of safety behaviors. We know some people stay glued to the news. I have a family member who can't turn the news off, watches it all the time because she believes it's going to keep her safe, seeing every little bit of news that's coming along. And in fact, what's happening is the more she watches, the more anxious she gets. And so it actually makes the problem worse for her. So where is the cutoff between knowing enough and becoming so immersed that we can't get our heads out of that hamster wheel we're caught on? There's also some people that just in general worry about health issues and search for information, get medical tests. I remember working with a person who would get medical tests, particularly heart. This person was very worried about their heart and then saw a program about anxiety. This even comes up in the mental health first aid course, that some people who are anxious also have heart attacks. And so just because they went to the hospital and found out they weren't having a heart attack today, doesn't mean they're not having a heart attack when they have a panic attack tomorrow. So there's this sense of searching for assurance by having lots of tests. But the nagging fear goes along with it that I've never had quite enough tests to tell me whether, in fact, something else might be wrong. So what are the symptoms of anxiety? There's this ongoing and persistent feeling of worry. And some people know on one day they're worried about this thing, but when they deal with it, there's something fresh just to fill in for it. So Friends and family sometimes struggle with being supportive because they know they've talked through the problem. And once they talk it through, this person comes up with a new problem. So the problem isn't actually the stuff out there, it's this feeling of anxiety, and I must be feeling anxious because something's wrong. So it's sort of turned around, the feeling of danger or doom. And this happens even when there's no stimulus, but the person that's worrying actually is searching their environment for an explanation about why they feel so anxious. It can be really interfering with work, with relationships, and it can also impair memory and concentration. I think particularly because the anxiety draws your attention away from things, and so you lose stuff. You forget things that you heard from other people because you weren't actually paying attention because the worry was drawing all of your attention. Anxiety can affect just about every part of your body. It affects heart. People have palpitations, chest pain, rapid heartbeat. It can affect breath, hyperventilation, shortness of breath. It can cause dizziness and headaches. Some people feel like they're having a stroke because their head hurts when they're anxious. This sweating happens. Some people get numb hands and they think that they've got problems wrong with their neck or their back, and they're going to be paralyzed because they have this feeling of numbness. Some people choke, get a dry mouth, they feel like throwing up. I know a person who changed their career path because they would throw up when they would get in front of people. They were so anxious and they couldn't do that anymore. And aches and pains, similar to depression and to grief, people talk about this just physical pain. Now, with anxiety, it's often because you're holding yourself tight. So people who are anxious will notice their neck and shoulders, up the back of their head. Some people even notice the muscles in their face are tight, that they've been squeezing their face up tight. So it impacts all the different functions in the body. Now, there are different parts of the diagnosis anxiety. So this is 5 of the predominant labels. And in a presentation like this, we really don't have time to get into all of the different disorders. But I'll just tell you in a nutshell. So the generalized anxiety disorder is where the person is sort of just low-grade worry, sometimes high-grade worry about everything all the time. With panic disorder, a person actually has panic attacks, and they often feel like they're having heart attacks when that happens. Some people with anxiety issues develop different kinds of phobias and fears. They may be afraid of going out, they may be afraid of certain people. So there's all kinds of different phobias and fears that might go along with it. All of us have some phobias. I know that I am so afraid of spiders, I don't even want to watch a show on TV that has spiders. So people have different kinds of phobias, but if they don't interfere with your life, then they're just sort of a part of being human. Social anxiety disorder keeps people from interacting with other people, keeps them home, isolated. Obsessive compulsive disorders where people have obsessions about something. So an obsession about whether or not the light switches are on. And then the compulsion is the action that happens. And so having to go back in the house and check over and over again, did I remember to turn the light switch off? I made some notes. Yes. So there was a question about eating disorders. And again, this is a question that could lead to massive discussion, lots of extended discussion about it. There are people in our city who are experts on eating disorders. Huge topic. But I do think that eating disorders fall into the area of looking at a obsessive compulsive disorder. Certainly some people fall into eating disorders for a whole variety of reasons, whether depression or experiences of bullying or social media. There's lots of reasons why it might happen for people, different for many people. Often eating disorders happen when people feel out of control and they feel like what they eat is one thing they can control, so it goes along with that. So what happens with an eating disorder is a person becomes obsessed with their body weight and their diet. And some people can be obsessed with their body weight without being with their diet, and vice versa. So you remember I was saying the obsession happens, and then the compulsive action happens in response to that obsession. So the compulsions that go along with eating disorders might include dieting or binging, exercising, and sometimes there's some fairly extreme, life-threatening ways that people will attempt to lose weight. It seems like it's more prevalent in society today, and I think certainly pressure on people for what their body image is makes it even harder. I've worked with young men as well as young women who were concerned about the appearance of their bodies. And it does seem to go along with all the access to social media. It's really individualized. And so each individual person that struggles with it, it is a different journey for them about what they need to do in order to step away from it. Certainly eating disorders happen for people that have experienced some sort of trauma, bullying at school, but it also there's some speculation of eating disorders being related to body chemistry similar to depression. So not really good answers for that for you, but in my experience that eating disorders fall into this obsessive compulsive way of looking at the world. So we're going to talk more about what helps. So I'm going to zip back. I talked just briefly last time about some of the specific things that helped for grief and depression, and I'll mention something a little bit about what happens specifically, or what helps for anxiety specifically. And then talk more about some general self-help strategies. Oh, I'm getting ahead of myself with my slides. So you remember when we talk about grief, when it's uncomplicated, really support and time, people getting a chance to talk about their story, talk about their experience, and then do things that allow them to feel healthy. So when they feel able to, going for walks, being in nature, making sure that they have a good diet, getting enough sleep, but telling the story with loved ones and feeling supported by friends and family is the most curative thing for people that are experiencing grief. Allowing person to tell the story actually doesn't increase the risk of the loss becoming complicated. It helps the person move through. They feel less and less need to tell that story as they've processed it and it becomes more real. A person is more likely to get stuck in grief when they felt like they weren't able to talk about what the loss was. So with grief, individual needs to be able to kind of lean into that pain that goes with it, push themselves to do things that increase their capacity to feel uncomfortable. Sit with the feelings of sadness for periods of time. But that doesn't mean just drowning in it. Once you've done that for a period of time, then also making sure you do things that are pleasurable and are with other people, ways to feel good about yourself. So it's a balancing act of stepping in for a period of time and then stepping back. And that normal grieving process happens. With depression, similarly, there can be some self-help strategies that are very effective. Diet and exercise, and I always feel like a phony when I say that, because diet and exercise is the thing I hate the most. I hate it when people tell me that that's a treatment. I don't want to hear that part. But in fact, the research says, Ruth, that's what you need to pay attention to. With depression, increasing your time in the sunlight makes a difference. And it isn't laying on a deck chair with your eyes shut, but in fact, sunlight going through the pupils of your eyes is what changes your body chemistry, what stimulates that production of neurotransmitters in the brain. So you can get that happening in the middle of the winter on a 40 below day that's bright sunny if you sit in a big sunny window. You can have light entering your eyes to the degree that it can make a difference to the neurotransmitters in the brain. Some people with depression, medication might become important. But as you remember from last week, what I said is that what the research says is that medication generally isn't very effective for mild depression, can be very effective for more severe depression. But for mild depression, it's considered actually to be less effective than placebo treatments. So you can take Smarty for depression if it's a mild depression, and it would work as well as antidepressants. The difference between grief and depression is what you need to talk about. With grief, you talk more about the loss. With depression, you want to step away from what the loss is. You want to focus on what a person's doing that helps them to manage, rather than talk about what it is that's created the problem. Now, the depression story might need some telling at some point in time. There might be a point at the beginning of treatment where a person needs to talk about what it was that led to their mood going this way. My experience is that insight doesn't create recovery. So we may figure out what it is that caused the problem, but recovery comes from being present focused, future focused, and focused on coping strategies. So when I'm feeling a little bit better, what are the things that I'm doing that are helping me to feel a little bit better? When I'm feeling worse, what do I need to remember from those better days that I need to do, even if I don't feel like it? So if I notice that I feel a little bit better when I sit on the front step for a bit, do I feel a little bit better when the dog is on my knee and I'm scratching his chin? Do I feel a little bit better when I phone a friend or somebody in my family? Noticing what it is that makes you feel a little bit better and spending more time doing those things and less time thinking about what's happening when I'm not functional. Now, the challenge is that some people feel like that sort of Pollyanna approach, just thinking about positive stuff. And really, that's not the case. The thing is, when our mood is low, we're kind of obsessed with what's negative and don't notice what's positive. So this can be a corrective experience where you actually force yourself to look at the positives to balance it out so that the negative stuff isn't drawing all your attention. The negative stuff helps us to feel helpless and hopeless and feel like we can't do something different. But really, when you start to notice in your life that there are things that are helpful, you want to do more of those things. And I think Lindsay was saying there's talk about CBD oil, anxiety, sleep, depression. So I believe you need to talk to your doctor about it, although I know that some of the people that promote the use of CBD oil have talked with their doctors and they've been told not to use it. But some people do have really poor reactions. I talked with a person recently who was having horrible nightmares since beginning on the oil. So it isn't a cure for everything for everybody. I can certainly see why people experiment with it because there's lots of promotion of it. uh, I really strongly encourage you to go the medical route and talk to medical folks. The other thing is that it can interfere with other treatments that you're on. So some people have terrible reactions to it, and you don't want to be that person if you're already struggling with your mood. And you need to do considerable research. And research doesn't mean just talk to somebody who said they had a good response. It means doing more reading and communicating with people who have medical backgrounds. For some people, it can be quite helpful, but you want to be sure that you find out if you're a person that there's any risk factors for using it. The fact is, marijuana can be addictive, and it can also create some pretty serious problems for people. And so I know CBD doesn't have the oil doesn't have some of the same characteristics as the full dose of marijuana, but you do want to be careful with that before you start to experiment with it. Does that help? So yes, if somebody tells you that they're going to start using CBD oil, I would check with them first whether they've done any sort of exploration about it anywhere except on a website that promotes it. You know, we can say I've gone on the internet and researched stuff, but if we've gone down a rabbit hole that says CBD oil is good, we're not going to read any of the stuff that has the negative side effects. So we need to do a full investigation of it rather than creating a whole new set of problems for ourselves. None of us would, well, maybe some people would, but I think by and large, people wouldn't start taking an antidepressant because they're pretty serious medications. You wouldn't do that without consulting with medical folks. So you want to get some information before you take that pathway. So that is what I have to say sort of briefly about depression specifically. Anxiety specifically, I don't know, have any of you seen that video by Bob Newhart called Stop It? If you haven't seen it, you have to go and look for it. It's just, if you type in Bob Newhart, Stop It. Now, I've been told that I have a skewed sense of humor, and my own kids thought that I had sort of a mean streak, that I laughed so hard when I watched it. But I laughed so hard I cried when I watched it. Anyway, when somebody has anxiety, the temptation is to keep talking about their specific worries. And what happens is the more they talk about it, the more they worry. The more they read about it, the more they worry. The more they gather information, the more they worry. And so talking about it, gathering information is the opposite of what helps. With anxiety, we just need to stop it. We need to stop talking about the anxiety, stop talking about what we think is causing the anxiety. We need to find a way to quiet our thoughts, to slow our thoughts down, and instead focus on what is helpful. The most helpful thing is probably the simplest thing to say, and maybe very complicated for some people to do, but it's to focus on your breathing. So I know lots of folks get into yoga, and very, very helpful. Meditation. I highly recommend that for people that are struggling with anxiety. But you can do some deep breathing without ever joining any kind of program or any kind of course. What you want to do is pay attention to the way you're breathing. So people with anxiety, excuse me, kind of hyperventilate. And what I mean by that is they're breathing more at the, they're just filling up the top area of their lungs, and they're not filling their lungs completely. While I'm talking here today, just try this. Put one hand on the top of your chest and one hand on your tummy, and pay attention to which hand is moving. Now, if we were all in a room together, I'd be watching you to see what's happening for you. But what you actually want to have happen is that bottom hand that's on your tummy. You want to see it moving because you want to breathe deeply enough. It fills your lungs sufficiently that they push down on your diaphragm and push your tummy out. Now, if you can convince yourself to sit for a little while, even if you have some tea after breakfast, lunch, and supper, and sit quietly and take 4 deep breaths, and slowly train yourself as you're doing that to breathe in sufficiently that it pushes your tummy out. Now, take some practice, because if you've been breathing where you just feel this upper hand moving, then what you've been doing is actually a bit of hyperventilating. And what's happening is that you're signaling your body, you're flushing out all the carbon dioxide in your blood, and your body isn't having the signal to get a breath. And all of a sudden, your body goes, oh, I've got no air, and it panics. And so the panic that you feel with a person with anxiety comes from that hyperventilation. What your brain is actually saying is the same thing as when you're drowning. I'm dying, because you've been shortchanging yourself on how much oxygen is in your blood. So slow down your breathing. Oh, I saw somebody that is saying that there's an app on Apple Watches that helps you to inhale and exhale. So if you have an Apple Watch, that's a great thing to experiment with. Isn't technology amazing for stuff more than just watching people gossip with each other? Now, my suggestion is if you're not accustomed to do this, don't try doing long meditations or long yoga sessions at the beginning, because your busy brain will kind of get going. And what happens with all this quiet time is it starts scrolling through all the things you're worried about again. So what works most effectively is to spend a short period of time. So the count of 4 breaths. So you're going to breathe in and out slowly for 4 breaths. There's some breathing exercises you can look up online. The one I like best is actually just to count, where you count to breathe in, to hold the breath, to exhale, and then to hold. And they call it a square pattern. So each part of the square you count 4. In, 2, 3, 4. Hold, 2, 3, 4. Out, 2, 3, 4. Hold, 2, 3, 4. I'm seeing all kinds of suggestions continuing to pop up on the chat. So take note of those things and have a look at it. This is a simple one. You don't need an app. You don't need anything. And if you use that square pattern, you can set a timer for 2 minutes, or you can just simply count how many breaths you've had, but keep it very short. Now, the beauty of the counting is it draws your attention. So it stops your head from thinking about what you're obsessed with. And then also it's training your body what it feels like to be relaxed. So if somebody in your family says, oh, get over it, just relax, that doesn't relax you. But if you're saying to yourself, I know what it feels like when I'm relaxed, relax, you can actually start to call on that feeling. It's just like doing any kind of other exercise. Your body starts to figure out what that is and knows how to do it. So this is actually, I think, the most effective treatment for anxiety. The risk for taking medication for anxiety can be that it works really easily, and so people become quite easily addicted to the medication. And then the challenge is that people become resistant to the medication. Their dosages have to continuously increase. And in the meantime, they also haven't learned how to manage the anxiety themselves. They become dependent on something external. Now, when a person is in the throes of an anxiety attack, a panic attack, that's not the time to teach them how to do this stuff. And for some people, they're in a real serious phase in their lives, whether there's been some really difficult stuff happening or some serious health issues. And for those people, medication may be essential to kind of get them through that point in time. But by and large, moving into this self-help thing of doing the deep breathing, using whatever apps or programs that you can find that have been suggested tonight. But if you're not comfortable with those things, just simply counting your way around a square can make a huge difference as long as you do it regularly through the course of the day and help your body learn how to be relaxed. Okay, so those are some of the specifics. Now I want to talk more in general about self-help strategies, what works for everything. So activity, as I said, physical fitness isn't my favorite thing, but I certainly know that being physically active makes a huge difference. Even if it means a slow wander down the street, you don't even get very far. Even if you're not counting 10,000 steps on your Fitbit, some level of physical activity every day makes a huge difference. And you want and do it. Even if you don't feel like doing it, make yourself do it. It's not about fitness goals. When we're talking about it for mood, it's just simply about reactivation. You want to do a little bit more than you're doing right now. So if you've managed to get yourself out on the step, then tomorrow get yourself down to the end of the sidewalk in front of your house. Or if living in a big building, walking down the hall, doing a little bit more today than what you did yesterday. The exercise stimulates the neurotransmitters. It also distracts you from what is upsetting you. And exercise can lead you to being connected socially. People, even with being socially distant, can go for walks together if they keep a few feet apart from each other. So exercise can be helpful on many levels. Now, diet, similarly, not my favorite topic. When we think about diet related to your mood, again, it's not about weight loss. In fact, focusing on weight loss when you're struggling with your mood is kind of not helpful. It makes you feel worse about yourself. But serotonin is produced in the gut. 90% of the body's serotonin is located in the GI system. So if you have stable blood sugars, you will have a more stable mood. Well-nourished bodies can deal with stress. So just think about that. The neurotransmitters that affect your brain are actually coming from your tummy. And so when we feed our bodies properly, we're feeding our brains properly. Avoid alcohol. And so maybe I shouldn't have to say this at a United Church event. Anyway, it's not, when I'm talking about avoiding alcohol, it's not about a moral imperative. It's a physical imperative. Alcohol is a depressant. And it doesn't take much alcohol to trigger low mood. People talk about with addictions drinking so much that they might have a hangover. But actually a very small amount of liquor, even though it doesn't create a hangover, it actually creates a chemical interaction that causes a person's mood to drop. So we read about having a glass of red wine being good for us, but in fact, people who have a risk of low mood, a glass of red wine can be one of the things that's actually making that mood worse. So steer clear of any kind of alcohol when you're struggling with your mood. So that's the downer, the depressant. Steer clear of caffeine as well, because it can be very stimulating, make it hard to sleep. It can stimulate a person's anxiety. And then sleep. We need to get enough sleep in order to feel well. Some people struggle with sleeping, and so you might want to look into things around good sleep hygiene. For instance, not having your screens with you in bed, because the light that comes off of them triggers a part of the brain that tries to convince you not to go to sleep. So if you have struggle sleeping, there you need to investigate what will lead you to having good sleep hygiene. You can find that on the internet. There's lots of information about that. So when you're laying awake at night, not supposed to be on your iPhone, you can pick your iPhone up and look up why it is you're awake late at night. So not only getting active, but getting outside. Just being outdoors, there's the light therapy. The light entering through your eyes stimulates those neurotransmitters and helps you to feel better. Connecting with positive people who know our strengths and pay attention to our successes. So a long time ago, I did a project learning about social connection. And what I realized was that telling people to be around friends and family wasn't always helpful, because some people find some of their friends and some of their family to be pretty critical. So when you're struggling with your mood, you need to be quite selective that who you're spending time with is the people who you feel are positive people. They're not gossiping about others. They're not telling us we need to try harder. They're the people who notice what we're doing. They're the people who say, my gosh, I can't believe you're doing what you're doing when you've had so many struggles. The positive people are the ones that we need to spend time with. So you may even need to spend some time thinking about who is it I'm going to call who is more positive, and who am I going to kind of take a break from when my mood is low, because I don't feel better after I've been around them. But when I was talking about anxiety, I guess I already kind of touched this one, just focusing on your breathing. Yeah, I was going to teach you a breathing exercise and forgot I already had that in the stuff on anxiety. So catching your breath, taking a deep breath makes a huge difference for any mood disorders. Spiritual well-being. So for some, that means going to church, praying. But spiritual well-being is about having a connection to something that's bigger than ourselves. Believing that life is meaningful. There is a point to getting up every morning. There's a reason for my life. There is something that I can do that gives life meaning. For some people, having struggled with depression or anxiety, the meaning that they find is that they can be support to other people with similar struggles because they have some insight into it. So finding a meaning in what we've been through and knowing that that gives us a purpose. When we think about suffering, I think about the difference in pain. It's in the same place if you have pain from childbirth and pain from endometriosis. Pain from childbirth has meaning and purpose. Pain from endometriosis is just pain. And so finding this bigger meaning allows us to tolerate the pain, because we know that life is more than just today. Life is more than just me. Finding a sense of purpose. That's the beauty of doing a talk like this with people in faith belief system, because this is what we believe, is that there is a purpose that's bigger than ourselves. Bye, Brenda Curtis. So that is one of the very important, probably one of the most important curative parts of dealing with mood disorders. I already mentioned alcohol, and it's worth mentioning again. When I worked with clients, they felt like I was kind of getting preachy on this stuff. That's also why I'm partly concerned about CBD oil. Like, there's lots of differences of opinion about what those kinds of chemical compounds can do in the brain. If you're struggling with anything that depresses or settles you, it can create some real serious problems for people in the way it messes with the chemistry in your brain. So steer clear when you're struggling with your mood. Now, some people talk about how helpful it is to look at self-help books. Here's a variety of different books. The 4 in the one corner came from one person I know that did a lot of investigation about what would be helpful for anxiety. The anxiety and phobia workbook is one that I used throughout the years that I was working with people. It has lots of information about different self-help strategies, but not only self-help books. I think books about positive messages about the meaning of life. Brene Brown's books are just incredibly helpful for people. She's written lots of books since, but my favorite is still The Gifts of Imperfection, because those are fairly short chapters and you can sort of bite into a piece that you can work on for yourself. Even if you're in a support group of people, you can bite into a piece where that group can sort out one of the ways of being more positive. Yes, Anxiety Canada is a good website as well. One of the books that I enjoyed is by Sean Aker, The Happiness Advantage. And if you like looking at TED Talks, I highly recommend the Sean Aker TED Talk. That's about the happiness advantage. It talks about how to keep your brain more positively focused. So the book is lots more detailed about what he talks about in his TED Talk. But I want to sort of put some caution to this as well. Self-isolation is not good for us when we're struggling with mood. And so if we figure we can sort this stuff out by sitting alone and reading a book, we're mistaken. That isn't enough. And so for some people, they grab the book because then they think they don't need to tell people. Now, if you find a book and you get excited about what you're reading and you call up a friend or a family member and talk with them about what you're reading, that can be very, very helpful and stimulating. And you might come up with some solutions for yourselves. But to simply read these books and be alone with the information only increases that sense of aloneness. So I would discourage you from using them in that way. So I'm going to flip through the next couple of slides really quickly, not because they're not important, but just because we're getting pretty far into the evening. So healthy thinking, one of the counseling strategies is cognitive behavioral therapy, and it's about how you restructure your thinking to look at more positive stuff. But none of us can be positive all the time. There's some hard things that happen in life, but we can have a healthy way of approaching even the bad stuff that goes on for us. So healthy thinking is being able to pay attention to both the positive and the negative and the neutral without getting caught in one. When our mood is struggling, what the temptation is to focus on the negative, to just sort of worry over all those things that have gone on, what's gone wrong. With physical health issues, they look at what's wrong with you and they can come up with a cure. It would make sense if mental health issues were the same. But in fact, no, if we put all of our intention into what's wrong, what's negative, we won't come up with a solution. So healthy thinking is finding a balanced view where I can understand some tough things have happened, and then I can look at the positives of how I managed that. Oh, I didn't know my slide did this. This is discovering that there's moving pieces in it. So what does unhealthy thinking look like? People know about when you run into people with it, it's repetitive thoughts, negative self-talk, saying I'm just a dummy, I'm an idiot, letting yourself worry all the time. Unhealthy thinking can be where we only notice problems. We assume that the worst outcome is going to come, and we always identify with the extreme. So either everything is perfect, I'm great, it's all good, or the world is ending, nothing's good, it doesn't matter, there was one thing good because everything else is bad. So what is important about the unhealthy thoughts is to challenge them, to ask yourself questions when you're finding yourself in those extremes. Is it true? Might there be other ways of looking at this? What are the strengths I have in dealing with this stuff? When people get involved in counseling, that's some of what you can do is work with a counselor to explore those unhealthy thoughts and then move into more healthy thinking strategies and finding a different way of looking at the world. So that is one of the most helpful kinds of counseling, is challenging those negative thoughts. For some people, simply the support that comes from talking to somebody who is unbiased, doesn't know you, can be helpful as well. But often people don't need to take the route of going to a counselor. If you feel like you've got lots of support in your world, and friends and family around you, I know there's people in the ministry at this session today who have very good instincts, can provide support to people. There's a question about suggestions for finding counseling. So there are lots of private counseling agencies in the phone book. Oh, nobody uses the phone book anymore. Online, there's lots of private counseling agencies you can look at. And if you know anybody else that's tried them, in fact, you can look online and you can see where they'll say it was great or it wasn't great. I worked in the public sector for all of my career. It's only recently that I've started to see some people privately. I was very impressed with the kinds of people that were attracted to work in the public sector. And so later in this presentation, we're almost at that slide of the contact information for mental health and addiction services. And they connect you to the mental health and addictions teams across the province. That's free counseling. A lot of it is available right now with COVID. Lots of services are available through video conferencing. There's a specific, it's not Zoom that they use, but there's a tool like that they use when they're part of the health system. So it's free service. Even calling the intake workers are also counselors and can do some brainstorming, and they will often have some recommendations if there's a wait time in a certain community. They'll have some recommendations about counselors within that community that might have a specific focus. So please make use of that phone number for the public counseling services. Farm stress line can be helpful in Saskatchewan. Yeah. I think you can find the phone number for the farm stress line. Again, I was going to say it's from the phone book, but that must be online. Just type in farm stress line. And by varying degrees, that line has been very busy at some points in time. At one point, I was working as part of the rural counseling team, and the farm stress line was part of the work team that I was in. And so it works the same as phoning crisis intervention service. There's people manning the line. Some of the time, people are looking for financial advice, not just emotional advice. People going bankrupt on their farm or whatever. So that's certainly a resource that people can make use of. Talk with your doctor. Some doctors are better than others for understanding mental health issues. And there are so many doctors in the city, I can't tell you which is which. But if you go to your doctor and you feel like you're kind of getting blown off, then you realize I need to talk to somebody else. But for many people, when they go to the doctor, they'll make some referrals for you. If your mental health issues are serious enough that you need to see a psychiatrist, the only route to a psychiatrist is through your family doctor. There is a shortage of psychiatrists in our province. But one of the things that the psychiatrists have started to do is consultation. So the doctors will talk with them about the symptoms a person is struggling with, and the psychiatrist will give advice about any kind of interventions that a medical doctor can do as well. So talking with your doctor is certainly one of the routes that can be helpful for people. I also want to mention caring for yourself as a caregiver, often the person that has the mental health issue is getting the lion's share of the attention. Well, generally that's the case because they've been ill. They're in a lot of distress and sometimes in considerable danger. But being the caregiver can have a huge impact on your own well-being. So you want to find ways also to address your stress in response to that role of being a caregiver. There is actually a number of different caregiver support groups, and the Canadian Mental Health Association has one of them, but I'll give you a contact number for that. I can't just flash something up, I think, that folks can see on the chat line. I didn't see the whole message there. So the caregiving things, the self-care things that I've suggested are very important for you if you're a caregiver, even if you're not going through these sorts of difficulties to the same degree. You want to be sure that you don't also end up down a hole because you're shortchanging yourself in looking after yourself. They tell you as a lifeguard to take care of yourself. Don't jump in the pool with the person that's drowning or they'll drown you. You need to stay somewhere that is safe for yourself. When you're on an airplane, will we ever get to go on airplanes again? When you're on an airplane, you need to give yourself oxygen before you give it to the person you're sitting beside. So you need to care for yourself when you're a caregiver. So here's the resources, and Kent maybe could include those in stuff he sends out to your group. Centralized intake, the first one here is the intake workers who can give you information about resources across the province. Crisis intervention services, many people who are thinking about suicide are contacting this service. And as a caregiver, you can also contact them and let them know you have concerns about somebody and you don't know what you need to do. So please use those two numbers. They're there for everyday people to make use of. You can also make use of these different kinds of support groups that are available. And some of them are going virtually now. I know when COVID's done, they'll be back to face-to-face, but it's great to have some virtual access. You can see on here the Family Matters support group at Canadian Mental Health Association and the Postpartum support group, two really important programs that are available for people. So you can take a screenshot of this or take a picture with your phone if you want, but also can share that. Now, websites, I talked with one of the intake workers I used to work with. This is the website she promotes quite strongly is in regards to dealing with depression and anxiety, comes from CMHA. So have a look at that. And finally, there's a program called Online Therapy run through the University of Regina. It's been supported, mental health counselors across the province assisted with providing online therapy. I was one of those people that did that, where it was a combination of communicating with people through both computer and over the phone. They have actually now a dedicated group of people who provide therapy through that program. And you just need to type in online therapy user, as it says here, and you'll be able to get access to that and sign up for the online therapy program. Very helpful for people who are in rural communities. Of course, COVID has been very helpful for some people who are remote because they can also access counseling that's provided through WebEx now, whereas they previously had to drive in and see people. So that's my information, and I know I've gone longer than I planned to go. That always seems to happen. But are there some questions that people want to address before we wind down tonight?
just watching the chat, and people can please feel free to enter those in, and maybe as they do, I can sort of speak on behalf of everyone again. Ruth, this has been an incredible evening of information. When you talk about positive people to be around, you're one of my positive people that I just like being around. You just somehow you lift everything when I speak to you. Your insight, but also your straightforward way of presenting, and your compassion in a way that isn't weird is so great. It's such a wonderful image for all of us who are trying.
That's a compliment to not be weird.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's church. We're not good at that sometimes. We come. But yes, thank you for all of that. I have some information just to pass on to everyone. I think it's become very clear. There's a whole bunch of information in resources to get delivered to people, and we will do that. There will be messages coming to you with all of Ruth's resources, contact information, plus recording to all of both sessions. Last week's is already posted. We'll have this one posted up in the next few days. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff there. I would be I should draw attention to a couple of things. You talked about some training through different programs. I think that's probably something that we as the church can take some leadership in trying to set up some of those things, whether it's St. Andrews and CCS or Center for Christian Studies and the region. I already got some private messages from people saying that they know of some organizations and things. So that'll be something we'll be following up on. On that note, if people are interested in Center for Christian Studies, Scott sent me a reminder that they have their Grief and Loss Learning Circle that's coming up at the end of April. That's available to people. That's listed on the resource sheet that's been sent out to you, but if you're looking for information, let us know about that. Another reminder about all of the resources available at St. Andrews College, especially at the library. That's open to everybody in the public. We mentioned it last time. We'll send it to you for free, or St. Andrews will send it to you for free. They'll send you a little list so you can send it back for free. So anything that you can use there. And the last couple of things are just events that I hope will bring you joy and sort of raise those spirits. Easter is coming, and for region wide, we're planning an Easter sunrise service. So at 6:20 on Sunday morning, April the 4th. We'd love to have you all grab your phones or your couch or whatever you want to do and come join us for a Zoom worship to watch the sun come up across the province. It should be a really fun way to we can't do it in person, so we can watch the sun come up from Estevan all the way to Kindersley and enjoy the experience of Sunday morning on Easter sunrise. And then after that, at the end of April, we're having a spring concert. And I think that should help raise spirits too. We'll have a chance for everybody to do the same thing. We'll have a virtual concert with musicians from all around the province. It should be a great evening. So those are my plugs. I appreciate Ruth so much for everything you've done, and everyone here for being here as well. I guess we'll just leave everybody a chance to say thank you, but God bless you all, and blessings on your Lenten journey as we carry on in this faith community together.